Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. It was the summer solstice this last week and we're still right in the middle of summer in the Carolinas. It's been quite hot and our witchy garden, including the pollinator beds, has been in abundant bloom, including our edible daylilies. Although people around the world have been eating daylilies for thousands of years, I found that they aren't really a part of mainstream Western food. But they are edible as long as you make sure that you are correctly identifying what I'm referring to, which we'll get into a little bit more here in a moment. I personally love eating daylilies, and I think that because they do produce so many abundant buds and blossoms, they can be part of a lovely summer edible garden very, very easily. They grow very quickly, very well, and produce many blossoms with hardly any care. So they're a favorite of mine at this time of year. Daylilies are oftentimes considered simply an ornamental flower, or even I've seen them considered a roadside weed. Here in the Carolinas, if you were to drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains, at this time of year, they are abundant along the roadside. They're just everywhere. That actually, I've always loved them. The bright orange flowers coming in summer, it's always just been a sign that, well, midsummer has arrived, the summer solstice is right around the corner, and that's always been exciting for me. There is some confusion between daylilies and lilies. Daylilies and lilies are common names, and in some cases, they are interchangeable terms for describing plants that belong to two very different plant families. So take the common name tiger lily, for example. Both a plant that is entirely edible, something that I would consider a daylily from the family Xanthorrhoeaceae, subfamily Hemerocallidoideae, and one belonging to the lily family that I would consider poisonous, something from the family Liliaceae, are referred to as tiger lily. So if you were to go purchase flowers in a store in a bouquet because they're beautiful and look at two different flowers that are bright orange and referred to as tiger lilies, one of those would be edible, note on that in a moment, and one of them would be not. One of them would be poisonous. I say note on that in a moment because you really shouldn't be buying plants from, say, the florist section in a grocer's and then eating them or using them on any kind of mucous membranes because they're sprayed with preservatives and insecticides, and not a great idea. But you would commonly see both of these plants referred to as a tiger lily, and there is a difference in their appearance, but that common name problem makes it so that it's somewhat tricky to know whether or not it is safe to eat what people will point at and say, well, that's a daylily. Remember that common names can cause some confusion. So for example, if I were to have over a friend who only ever knew of tiger lilies or daylilies as a poisonous thing and say, hey, I made a tiger lily stir fry, they might be rather concerned and think that I was attempting to poison both of us either through ignorance or malice, but it's just a common name problem. The scientific classification of daylilies also changed in 2009. So prior to 2009, the scientific classifications of daylilies actually had them in the family Liliaceae. Many Liliaceae species, including the poisonous tiger lily that I just mentioned, which are sometimes referred to as orange Easter lilies or orange Asian lilies, have long been known to be poisonous. You know, you shouldn't have them around cats. Even cleaning the pollen off a cat's fur can make the cat very, very sick. In 2009, daylilies were removed from the Liliaceae family and assigned to the Xanthraceae family, subfamily Hemerocallidoideae. Now it's not uncommon to see daylilies referred to by a new common name, Hemerocallis, which I think helps with some of the confusion if you say this is, Hemerocallis instead of a lily. Unfortunately, when I was going to film sort of why you might want to cook with daylilies and show the recipe that we made, I actually found that a lot of websites online don't know what the distinction is. So I found websites saying it's not safe to eat daylilies because all lilies are poisonous, not realizing that there has been this change and they're not considered Liliaceae anymore. The one that alarmed me the most was the U.S. Department of Agriculture's website, where the old taxonomy, with it not being considered Hemerocallidoideae, but rather Lilidae, it's still on there. Another part of the website discusses that in 2004, a study was done that proved that all parts of the daylily, which in the article are referred to as Hemerocallis, are edible. Additionally, the two plants do look somewhat similar, so I can see why someone would be concerned that they were eating the wrong thing and potentially endangering themselves, their animals, and their loved ones. However, there are some very clear differences between the appearance of daylilies, Hemerocallis, and Asian lilies or tiger lilies or Easter lilies. They do look different from one another, and even someone who is not hugely experienced with differentiating between plant species should be able to tell the difference if they take their time to look over it. Obviously, please don't sue me if it turns out that you are eating something you've not properly identified. Please be very, very cautious and make sure that you are confident in your identification. So the foliage of a daylily, the Hemerocallis, looks like grass-like leaves emanating low to the ground, in essentially the same thing you'll see, grass-like bundles.
One of the ways that you can tell you have daylilies rather than the dangerous kind of lilies is the difference in the stalk and leaf formation. So the daylilies have these really long bare stalks coming out of leaves like this, whereas the lily, which you should not eat because they are poisonous, doesn't have a bare stalk, and its leaves aren't sort of down at the bottom with the bare stalk coming up out of it. The leaves are all along that stalk. So if you're looking at a lily, an orange lily, to wonder if you can eat it or not, if the stalk looks like this, no, you can't. You cannot eat that. That would be poisonous.
Additionally, the flower orientation is often different, though not always, as you can see in the footage that I just shared. Hemerocallis, daylilies, the blossoms are often upright, whereas Liliaceae tend to droop more. Not always, though. Lastly, there's a difference in their root structure. Daylily root systems tend to be more tuber-like, like little fingerling potatoes with fibrous roots. Lily roots, however, are bulbs, and they consist of oblong or arrowhead-shaped scales. Now, I mentioned already that Liliaceae is toxic to cats. Unfortunately, it's unclear if Hemerocallis is as well, and there is some debate on it. Although there have been no studies that prove that it is, I would say that if you're concerned about it, I wouldn't risk it. So the daylilies that I am cooking with in this particular video are considered common daylilies or orange daylilies, sometimes also referred to as tawny daylilies or double daylilies. Like I've already said, they do belong to the family Hemerocallidoideae, and they've just been placed there in 2009. I do need to note that large quantities of the leaves may be hallucinogenic. However, blanching the leaves is said to remove the hallucinatory component. Now, I've mentioned that they are edible. It should be noted that the flowers, leaves, and root are all edible. The leaves and young shoots cooked taste a lot like asparagus or celery. They're slightly sweet tasting, have a little bit of an anise or licorice-like flavor. The leaves need to be eaten quite young or they get very fibrous. The flowers can be eaten raw or cooked. The petals are thick and crunchy. And they're pretty pleasant eating raw because there's a sweetness, especially towards the base where there's nectar. The flowers can also be dried and used as a thickener in soups, in which case it's actually better to harvest them when they've already withered and closed up and have drooped on the head of the stem. The flower buds can also be cooked whole or served raw, and they also have a little bit of an asparagus-like flavor. They can also be dried and put into relishes or jams. So there's honestly just so much that you can do with this plant, and they're beautiful, and bees love them. Medicinally, they also have quite a few uses. Now, keep in mind that the amount that you'd be eating wouldn't necessarily be the same amount that you would use for medicine. And of course, I'm not a medical professional, so please don't take this as claims of medicinal benefit like a doctor would give, like a physician, medical doctor. Wow, I'm overheated and exhausted and stumbling over my words. Medicinally, they are diuretic, febrifuge, mild laxative. The flowers are anodyne, antiemetic, antispasmodic, depurative, febrifuge, and sedative. In Chinese medicine, they are often provided as an anodyne for people in childbirth. An extract of the flowers is sometimes used as a blood purifier. The rhizome has been shown to have antimicrobial activity and is also tuberculostatic and has some action against parasitic worms. It is used in Korean medicine to treat jaundice, constipation, and pneumonia. The juice of the roots is used in cases of arsenic poisoning, although I make no claims to its efficacy. The root also has a folk history in America in the treatment of cancer. Medicinally, in scientific studies, the extracts from the roots have shown some mild anti-tumor activity. However, I would never recommend that you cease taking your treatment for cancer and instead eat lots of daylily roots. Please don't do that. It's just fascinating. Lastly, the foliage has an additional use of being dried and plated into cord and used for making things, including shoes, which is fascinating. Anyway, lastly, I am cooking with two other somewhat uncommon ingredients. I say somewhat uncommon because they're quite common to my family, but I thought that I would just go ahead and touch on them. One I am cooking with is Portulaca oleracea, also called common purslane or purslane, which I really love and which is abundant at this time of year as a ground cover. It is also sometimes considered a weed, which is somewhat sad. The edible parts of purslane are the leaves, the green and tender stems, and the seeds. They tend to be delicious raw or cooked. They're often used in salads and quick stir fries, and because they are mucilaginous, they can be used to thicken soups. So you can actually have a daylily and purslane soup, or if you're using them in a stir fry, they will actually thicken a sauce, which is what I do in the rest of this video. The sauce is lime juice and soy sauce and sesame oil, and because there are these two mucilaginous plants, it thickens quite nicely around everything. The leaves have kind of a sour taste, in my personal opinion. It's a pleasant sour taste, a little bit spicy, a little bit salty, very much in the pleasant in a stir fry characteristics, especially with some lime and some garlic and some chili. The leaves can also be dried and rehydrated for use later. Medicinally, the plant is antibacterial, antiscorbutic, depurative, diuretic, and a febrifuge, as well as a source for omega-3 fatty acids, which strengthen the immune system. So I'm a big fan of using them. It should be noted that if you do use them, they need to go into a stir fry very, very much towards the end because they wilt down like that. If you want, you can make a stir fry essentially just of purslane. Some garlic, some chilies chopped up, a little bit of sesame oil, and just flash brown them for not even a minute or two, and then you can really taste the flavor and see what you might like to combine them with. The other thing that I'm cooking with in this video that isn't really common in Western cuisine, but which is quite common in Asian cuisine, is Barberia vulgaris, sometimes called yellow rocket, garden yellow rocket, winter cress, or rocket cress. You can actually buy it at Asian supermarkets, and I do often, but it is considered a weed in some places. It's considered a weed here, where I currently live. It tends to grow along roadsides, stream banks, hedges, and it will kind of take over if you let it, actually. So will purslane. It is edible. The flowers and leaves tend to be what you cook with. The young leaves are either eaten raw or cooked very similar to spinach. They have a hot and somewhat spicy flavor, similar to cress. The leaves can also be chopped up finely and added to salads, or older leaves, which are fibrous and somewhat unpleasant, can be cooked in water, and I'd actually recommend that you cook it in water, strain that water, and then cook it in water again. The leaves are available all year round, which is why sometimes the plant is referred to as winter cress. However, it also has abundant growth in summer, and you get these really beautiful, really flavorful little yellow blossoms. So I'm a fan of including it in summer stir fries and in winter soups. There's a potato soup that I like to make with cress, rocket cress. Anyway, medicinally, it's antiscorbutic, an appetizer, a diuretic, and a vulnerary. They've also been used as a poultice for treating wounds, but I couldn't find any studies supporting how effective that is, so would not recommend. Anyway, thrown all together, they make for a colorful and flavorful stir fry. Now, I did add some other ingredients, but you wouldn't have to get as many ingredients into your stir fry as I did. You could use fewer and still have a delicious stir fry. You could decide to just stir fry some daylily bulbs, or any of the other ingredients that I've used. But it was Midsummer, so I made a bit of an effort and threw in a lot of things that I thought might taste good together. And I was incredibly thrilled with how it turned out. Now I should note that this came together as fast as it is shown on the video. The cook time for the stir fry altogether was 7 minutes, maybe 8. So be prepared to move quickly and keep things moving in the pan, because it is finished very, very soon. And if you do, like I did, make fish along with it, the fish took 25 minutes to cook. So that had to be started in advance, and then the stir fry came together like that. So if you're making rice, if you're making fish, if you're making something else, you're going to have to stagger your cook time. To go along with the daylily and purslane and rocketcress stir fry, I decided that I was gonna make some fish and some rice. But we filmed similar things before, so I'm not going to get into it in depth. This is just a combination of fish sauce, soy sauce, sugar, lime juice, slices of lime, chilies, garlic, ginger, lemongrass, some garlic chives, and this is gonna get tossed on here and be what it cooks in. So really simple, flavorful fish to go along with the stir fry. I forgot to say, there's also galangal in there. So with making a stir fry where things cook very, 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 very quickly, having your ingredients prepped in advance so that you can just toss them in is important, especially when the things you are cooking with cook at different times. So the lotus root needs longer, then the woodier mushrooms need longer, the stems of the rocketcress need longer, these need longer. And then these cook very, very quickly. So do the little mushrooms, so does the purslane, and obviously the basil and the coriander and there's a garlic chive in there need hardly any time at all. So just having everything laid out so that you can sort of grab and go is really, really important. Unfortunately, I don't currently own a wok, so I have to kind of make this work with the dishes I have, which I really need to buy a wok. So with purslane, this is the part that you want, where this is very flexible and bendy and green. Where it starts to turn purple and brown, you don't want that for cooking with. It won't wilt down the same way. So anything like this and any of the leaves and blossoms is great, but not this part. First, I add toasted sesame oil and spice and chili infused sesame oil to my pan and turn the heat to medium-high and bring the oil up to shimmering. Then I add my sliced lotus root to the pan, being careful not to overcrowd them, as I want to get a nice even brown on at least one side, and I won't get that if they steam. The lotus root takes approximately 6 minutes to cook, so I'm starting with it. Then I add my rocketcress stems, as they take longer to cook than the leaves, and give everything a nice toss to combine it in the oil and make sure everything is evenly coated. Then I add my snow peas. At this point, everything has about 3 minutes left to cook. Then I add my king trumpet mushrooms, as they need a little bit longer to cook than the smaller mushrooms. Then I add some chopped ginger, though you could add finer minced ginger or grated ginger if you prefer, and some crushed garlic, though again you could grate this or mince it if you would prefer. Then the zest of 1 lime, and then chilies to taste. I'm using bird's eye chilies, though you could substitute another if you prefer, and I'm going relatively light on them as my family doesn't tolerate a great deal of spice. You can go as heavy as you want or leave them out entirely if you prefer. Then I'm adding the daylily bulbs. At this point, everything has about 2 minutes left to cook, which is all the time they need. And then the rocketcress greens, which will wilt down very quickly. I put on a lid to help steam them a little bit, just because I have a rather small pan, and it will make them easier to distribute through the rest of the stir fry. If you have a large wok, like I wish I had, you may not need to do this. Then I add the purslane when there's just about 1 minute to 1.5 minutes left in cook time, as it really doesn't need a lot of time. Then I add the enoki mushrooms, and the shimeji mushrooms. The basil, the coriander, also called cilantro, and the garlic chives, and some white pepper. You could use any color pepper you prefer. I just happen to like white pepper in stir fries. Give everything a nice toss. Make sure everything is cooked through and has some nice color on it. And then I deglaze the pan with soy sauce and the juice of 1 lime. As I've added a lot of ingredients that are mucilaginous and will thicken the sauce on their own, I don't bother with a cornstarch slurry. But if you've used less mucilaginous ingredients or you want a thicker sauce, you can make a cornstarch slurry out of a couple tablespoons of cornstarch, some warm soy sauce or some warm water, and thicken the sauce with that. I served everything with the fish and with some simple steamed rice. If you do cook with any daylily bulbs while they're still out and abundant this summer, let me know how you liked them, and please be certain of your plant identification before you ingest them. Alright, happy summer. Be safe out there.